Picture this. It's December 21st, 1992. The morning air in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, bites with winter cold. Ice crystals cling to car windows. Inside a modest townhouse in the East Lampeter Township condominium complex, wrapped Christmas presents sit waiting beneath a small tree. A young teacher has carefully chosen each gift for her sixth-grade students' tokens of affection from someone who lives to see children smile. But Christy Mirac will never deliver those presents. By 9:30 that morning, her principal will find her body on the living room floor, her face beaten beyond recognition, her dreams extinguished just 4 days before Christmas. The presents scattered across the room in the chaos of a violent struggle will become silent witnesses to a crime that would haunt an entire community for more than a quarter century. What makes this case extraordinary isn't just its brutality or its duration. It's the fact that the killer never left. He didn't flee to another state or disappear into the shadows. He stayed right there, in Lancaster, building a career, attending church, playing music at weddings and school dances. For 26 years, he smiled at the same people who mourned Christy Mirac. He celebrated life while harboring a secret he thought he'd buried forever. This is the story of how a single piece of discarded chewing gum, a revolutionary science, and a family's relentless determination finally brought a monster out of hiding. This is the story of Christy Mirac and the man the community knew as DJ Freeze. I'm taking you inside one of Pennsylvania's most haunting cold cases, and I'm telling it from an angle you haven't heard before. Through the lens of the invisible killer, the science that exposed him, and the community that unknowingly harbored him for decades. Before Christy Mirac became a headline, before her name was synonymous with tragedy, she was simply a girl with an unwavering dream. Born on November 3, 1967, in Shamokin, Pennsylvania, a quiet mountain-carved town in Northumberland County, Christy grew up in the heart of a close-knit family. She was the middle of 3 children, sandwiched between her brother Vince and her sister Alicia. According to Lancaster Online, Vince would later describe his sister as possessing a unique blend of iron-willed stubbornness and infectious kindness, a woman who lived to make those around her smile. But even as a child, Christy was defined by a singular ambition. She was going to be a teacher. This wasn't a passing fancy or a childhood whim that would fade with time. Teaching was woven into the fabric of who Christy was. When she played with her siblings, the games rarely varied. In their living room, Christy was always the educator, and Vince and Alicia were always her students. She approached these childhood role plays with quiet seriousness, a foreshadowing of the professional excellence that would one day define her adult life. In 1985, Christy graduated from high school and left Shamokin to pursue her degree at Millersville University of Pennsylvania, a public institution located roughly 85 miles from her family home. There, she dedicated herself to the study of primary education, eventually earning her diploma and the right to lead a classroom of her own. By 1992, at just 25 years old, Christy had achieved her lifelong dream. She had settled in Lancaster County and secured a position as a 6th-grade teacher at Rohrerstown Elementary School. Her principal, Harry Goodman, observed her as a woman who possessed an innate, natural synchrony with her students. She wasn't just happy in her chosen field, she was exceptional at it. Christy was also known for an almost obsessive level of punctuality. In the high-stakes environment of a school morning, where every minute is accounted for, Christy Mirac was always exactly where she was supposed to be. Always on time, always prepared, always present. until December 21st, 1992. The winter of 1992 was approaching its peak. Rohrerstown Elementary School buzzed with the restless energy of children looking forward to winter break. On December 21st, a Monday morning, only 2 days remained before the school would close for the holidays. It should have been a time for final lessons and festive preparations. But as the clocks in the hallways moved past the start of the school day, Christy Mirac's classroom remained empty. Harry Goodman, the school principal, began to worry. According to ABC News, he dialed Christy's home phone 5 separate times, his concern mounting as each call was diverted to her answering machine. He left several messages before deciding to contact her mother in Shamokin. The conversation was brief but alarming. Her mother confirmed that Christy was never late and would never miss work without notice. Realizing Christy had no local relatives to check on her, Goodman told her mother he would drive to her residence himself. He reached the East Lampeter Township condominium complex shortly after 9 a.m. The first detail he noticed was Christy's car sitting in the driveway, its windows glazed by a thick, undisturbed layer of ice, an indication that the vehicle had not been started that morning. As he moved toward the entrance, he saw that the front door was not fully closed but stood slightly ajar. What Harry Goodman discovered next would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm yelling, 'Christy, Christy, Christy,'" Goodman later told ABC News. When he opened the door to her living room, he found Christy Mirac's body on the floor. She was still wearing her coat and gloves, as if she had been preparing to leave for work. The scene was horrific. Christy had sustained severe facial injuries. Her jaw was fractured. Deep contusions around her neck indicated she had been strangled. She was nude from the waist down except for her socks, while her upper clothing, a sweater and t-shirt, had been pulled up, leaving her chest exposed. Near her head lay a wooden cutting board with a toaster resting on top of it. Forensic analysis would later determine that the cutting board had been used as a blunt force weapon to beat her. The wrapped Christmas presents she had prepared for her students were scattered across the room, evidence of a violent struggle. Harry Goodman fled the house and began pounding frantically on the doors of surrounding units, desperate for someone to help him. A neighbor eventually opened their door, allowing Goodman to call 911. Within 6 minutes, the first police cruisers arrived at the scene. "I struggled for years with this," Goodman later admitted. "Screaming nightmares." The images he witnessed that morning would follow him for years, resulting in recurring nightmares and the need for professional therapy. As responding officers processed the crime scene, they began piecing together a timeline of the attack. Christy's roommate had left the townhouse for work at approximately 7 a.m., her standard practice. Shortly after 7:15 a.m., the roommate had briefly spoken with a neighbor who was walking her dog outside. During their conversation, both women heard a loud, high-pitched scream coming from the direction of Christy's residence. At the time, they weren't certain it was Christy who had screamed. But investigators would later determine that this scream marked the beginning of the attack. Because Christy typically left for work between 7:30 and 7:45 a.m., police believed the killer had timed the attack to occur during the brief window when she was home alone after her roommate left, but before Christy departed for school. The neighbor walking her dog also reported seeing a white car parked in a lot across from Christy's home at approximately 7:15 a.m. She described the vehicle as similar to a Dodge Daytona, featuring black louvers or shutters over the rear window. She saw a white, muscular man with dark hair exit the car and walk toward Christy's house. This description would prove crucial, but it would take 26 years before investigators could connect it to a suspect. At 11 a.m., investigators contacted the Mirac family in Shamokin. Aware that Vince and his mother still faced a 2-hour drive to Lancaster, they chose not to describe the crime over the phone. Instead, they told them only that Christy had been involved in an accident and that they needed to come to the city immediately. The vagueness of the call was deeply unsettling. "We kept calling and calling and calling," Vince Mirac later recalled to ABC News. "And finally, when somebody answered her phone at her apartment, they acknowledged themselves as being someone from law enforcement, and that there's been an accident, and she passed." As Vince and his mother drove toward Lancaster, the silence inside the car filled with questions no one dared to answer aloud. Was Christy injured? Was she conscious? Why would no one explain what had happened? Vince would later describe those 2 hours as the longest of his life, defined by an agonizing uncertainty and a growing sense of dread he could not yet name. That uncertainty ended only after they arrived in Lancaster, where investigators finally told them the truth. Christy had not been injured. She had been murdered. They were then asked if they wished to see her. They were allowed to view Christy's body, but they were not permitted to touch her. She lay motionless as her mother and brother stood only a few steps away, separated from her by procedure and law. Instinctively, her mother moved forward, reaching out toward her daughter as any parent would, only to be stopped by an officer who gently raised a hand and told her she could not. It was a quiet moment, brief and restrained, yet devastating in its finality. In that instant, the reality became undeniable. Christy was no longer someone they could protect, comfort, or hold. She was evidence now. On December 22nd, the day after the discovery of the body, a man arrived at Roarstown Elementary School asking to speak with Christy Mirac. The staff found it unsettling that he seemed unaware of the murder, which had already become a lead story in the local news. While one employee kept him in conversation, another contacted the police. When officers arrived, the man was identified as Daniel D'Addario, a married man nearly 20 years, Christy's senior, who had been her boyfriend for the past 2 years. Daniel agreed to accompany detectives to the station for questioning. As the interview progressed, a complicated picture of Christy's private life emerged, a relationship so discreet that her own family had been entirely unaware of its existence. Daniel explained that he and Christy had met at a bar and that the relationship had only recently ended. According to his account, Christy had broken up with him on December 19th, just 2 days before her death, because she wanted a more traditional future and a family of her own, something Daniel, who was already married, could not provide. The police viewed Daniel as a primary suspect, but his alibi proved resilient. He told investigators that on the morning of the murder, he was in the process of moving to Virginia to be with his wife. He provided documentation showing that he had been at a government office that morning to update his vehicle registration and driver's license. When detectives verified the timestamps on his paperwork, they matched his story perfectly. Daniel passed a polygraph test and provided a DNA sample which did not match the fluids found at the scene. He was eventually eliminated as a suspect. The principal, Harry Goodman, was also questioned extensively. On December 23rd, he was asked to come to the police station. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was a sharp contrast to the grief he had been experiencing. Detectives questioned whether it was normal for a school principal to drive to a teacher's house just because she was late for work. They asked if he found Christy attractive, if he'd ever had any physical contact with her. Goodman maintained his innocence, explaining that he knew Christy didn't have anyone else in town and he was worried about her. He agreed to take a polygraph test, and like Daniel before him, he passed. With no physical evidence linking him to the crime, Harry Goodman was also dismissed as a suspect. Meanwhile, forensic pathologist Dr. Wayne Ross performed the autopsy. The examination confirmed the brutal nature of the attack. Christy had suffered a fractured jaw and extensive blunt force trauma to her face, back, and the top of her head. Dr. Ross identified deep contusions and ligature marks on her neck, concluding that the cause of death was strangulation. The examination also provided definitive evidence of sexual assault. During the procedure, Dr. Ross collected several biological samples, intending to create a DNA profile of the perpetrator. In 1992, however, the FBI's DNA database was in its infancy, containing only the profiles of convicted offenders from 12 states. When Christie's evidence was submitted, the system returned no matches. The profile belonged to an unknown man. By March 1993, investigators had interviewed more than 500 people. During this process, they uncovered reports of a stalker who had been operating in the East Lampeter Township area around the time of the murder. They pursued these leads with hope. But again, the trail ended in a dead end. As the months turned into years, the case began to cool. By 1995, the number of interviews had reached 1,500, with 60 individuals identified as potential suspects. Each one was systematically investigated, and each one was eventually cleared. The detectives were left with a DNA profile of a man who seemed to have vanished and a family left to wait for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. While the legal search stalled, the Mirac family endured a more private and prolonged tragedy. Christy's mother began a difficult battle with cancer that would define the next decade of her life. The disease was recurrent. She would undergo treatment and reach periods of remission, only for the cancer to return years later. Throughout this cycle of illness, the weight of her daughter's unsolved murder remained an open wound. In December 2002, 10 years after Christy was killed, her mother's health finally failed. Before she passed away, she made a final solemn request to Vince. She asked him to never give up the search for answers. She died without knowing the identity of the person who had taken her daughter's life. In the days following the funeral, Lancaster Online published a brief interview with Vince Mirac. In the article, Vince reflected on how the years of unanswered questions had weighed heavily on his mother, compounding her illness and robbing her of any sense of closure. The loss of his mother only deepened Vince's resolve. By 2007, 15 years had passed since the murder. Seeking to reignite public interest, the Mirac family joined forces with the family of Linda Bittler, another young woman whose murder in the area remained unsolved. Together, they funded a large billboard along one of Lancaster's primary highways. The billboard featured photos of both women and a direct, haunting question. "Do you know who killed us?" Below the images, contact information for the families and the police was displayed. The campaign was born of desperate hope that seeing the victims' faces every day would eventually wear down the conscience of someone with information, or perhaps even provoke a confession from the killer himself. The billboard did succeed in generating a new wave of phone calls and tips. But as investigators followed each lead, they found the same lack of concrete evidence that had plagued the case since the beginning. For the people of Lancaster, the enduring mystery created a culture of quiet suspicion. Because no stranger had ever been caught, there was a persistent, unspoken fear that the killer was not a transient predator, but a neighbor, a coworker, or a local resident who had managed to blend back into the fabric of everyday life. This suspicion was not unfounded. For over 20 years, the man who had entered Christy's home on that freezing December morning continued to live, work, and socialize within the very community he had traumatized his DNA profile, remaining a nameless string of data in a system that was not yet capable of identifying him. In October 2015, 23 years after the crime, the investigation into the death of Christy Mirac was taken over by the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office, led by District Attorney Craig Stedman. Stedman believed that the forensic samples collected in 1992 held the key, and that the rapid advancement of DNA technology would finally allow police to identify the unknown man. Two detectives from the office had recently attended a law enforcement conference where they learned about Parabon Nanolabs, a private laboratory specializing in DNA phenotyping. The laboratory offered a program called Snapshot, which could utilize a DNA sample to predict the probable physical appearance of its owner. The investigators submitted the DNA evidence from the Mirac case to the laboratory. In March 2017, Parabon produced composite images depicting what the suspect might look like between the ages of 45 and 55. Initially, these images were shown only to Christy's family and her former acquaintances, in the hope that someone would recognize a face from her past. When no one could identify the man in the sketches, the district attorney's office decided to move the search into the public eye. On November 1, 2017, they held a press conference and released the composite images to the media. Despite the widespread coverage, the public release did not immediately yield a viable suspect. Then came the breakthrough that would change everything. On April 25, 2018, Vince Mirac was watching the news when he saw a report on the arrest of the Golden State Killer, Joseph D'Angelo, who had been caught using a new technology involving a public genetic database called gedmatch. Recognizing the potential for his sister's case, Vince immediately sent an email to Detective Chris Lynch and District Attorney Christine Wilson, asking if this technology could be applied to Christy's DNA evidence. The investigators were already moving in that direction. Parabon Nanolabs had reached out to the department to offer their services in genetic genealogy, the same method used to capture the Golden State Killer. The laboratory prepared the DNA sample from the carpet and uploaded it to gedmatch, seeking a match among the millions of people who had voluntarily submitted their genetic profiles for family research. The task of navigating the results was given to C.C. Moore, a prominent genetic genealogist. When Moore examined the DNA matches, she did not find the suspect himself, but she found several individuals identified as his close cousins. "I felt really drawn to Christy's case," Moore told ABC News. "She seemed like somebody that I would have liked." Using these matches as a foundation, Moore began the painstaking process of reverse genealogy. This involved building a family tree upward to find a common ancestor, and then tracing the branches of that tree back down to the present day. Moore's research eventually focused on a specific family in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with roots in Eastern Europe. However, she needed a more specific marker to confirm her suspicions. Years earlier, the snapshot phenotyping had indicated that the suspect possessed significant Latino ancestry, specifically from Puerto Rico. Moore began searching social media and local newspapers for a link between the Lancaster family and Puerto Rican heritage. Her breakthrough came from a local newspaper article featuring a man who lived and worked in the Lancaster community. In the article, the man discussed his love for cooking traditional Puerto Rican dishes, explaining that his father had been born in Puerto Rico before migrating to the United States. Moore had found the missing ancestral link. The man was identified as Raymond Charles Rowe. known locally as a successful wedding and club performer under the name DJ Freeze. To confirm her findings, Moore compared the suspect's DNA to a profile on gedmatch belonging to a woman who was identified as Roe's half-sister. The genetic markers confirmed a near-certain match. For the first time in 26 years, the nameless profile from the carpet had a name. It took Moore just a couple of days to turn a face and a name over to Lancaster investigators. When District Attorney Craig Stedman learned that Raymond Roe was the potential killer, he was struck by the realization that Roe had never left Lancaster. For 26 years, while police searched for a phantom, Roe had remained in the city, building a career as a well-known local celebrity. Known professionally as DJ Freeze, he had transitioned from playing house parties to becoming a successful wedding and club performer. A review of his history explained why he had never appeared on the investigative radar. He had no criminal record, which meant his DNA had never been entered into the government's databases. In 1992, at the time of the murder, Roe had been 23 or 24 years old. He lived just 4 miles from Christy's home and frequently performed at the local nightclubs she was known to frequent. According to Lancaster County officials, Roe's route to work took him past Mirac's apartment complex. He drove a white Toyota Celica in 1992, which matched the vehicle that witnesses saw parked near the complex on the morning of the murder. To move from a genealogical lead to a legal arrest, investigators needed a direct DNA match, which required them to obtain a fresh sample from Roe without his knowledge. On May 31, 2018, the Pennsylvania State Police assisted the District Attorney's Office in mounting a surveillance operation. They learned that Roe was scheduled to perform at an event at Smoketown Elementary School. An undercover female officer was sent to the school, where she managed to approach Roe and engage him in a brief, casual conversation. Throughout the event, she kept a close watch on his movements. When the event concluded and Roe departed, the officer moved to the trash receptacle where he had discarded several items. She collected a water bottle, a plastic cup, and a piece of used chewing gum. The laboratory compared the DNA from these discarded items to the profile generated from the 1992 crime scene. The result was a definitive 100% match. On June 25, 2018, Raymond Roe was brought in for questioning. During the interrogation, he initially denied having any contact with Christy Mirac or any involvement in her death. However, his demeanor shifted when detectives mentioned the reports of a stalker in Christy's neighborhood and asked about his vehicle at the time. Roe became visibly defensive, but admitted that he had owned a white Toyota Celica in 1992. The police theory was that Roe had become obsessed with Christy, stalking her to learn her morning routine and the exact moment her roommate left for work. He was arrested and charged with criminal homicide. On January 8, 2019, faced with overwhelming DNA evidence and seeking to avoid the possibility of the death penalty, Raymond Roe pleaded guilty to charges of murder, sexual abuse, and burglary. According to WGAL News, at the hearing, Roe turned and faced Christy Mirac's family, tearfully saying, "I'm sorry, sir." To the family, "I can't imagine what you're going through. I apologize." Vince Mirac also spoke, reading a statement in court. He told Roe, "You took away our joy, security, love for the Christmas holiday. Most of all, you took away our Christy." He added, "I always knew this day would come. Now you will never be free for a day again. I hope your life is as painful to you as the last 26 years has been for us." Roe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. with an additional 60 to 120 years added to the term. He provided no formal statement regarding his motive. District Attorney Craig Stedman later said, "The length of time that the defendant just went back to the community and enjoyed his life, it is chilling. It's haunting to all of us that he could just compartmentalize this and go back and literally enjoy his life." The resolution of the case brought a measure of peace to the Mirac family, but the legal battle did not end with the sentencing. In November 2020, Rowe filed a post-conviction petition seeking to have his sentence overturned or reduced. In a dramatic reversal of his guilty plea, he claimed during court hearings in late 2021 that he had been innocent of the murder. According to Fox 43, he alleged that his previous attorneys had pressured him into a plea deal while he was in a weakened physical and mental state. Rowe offered a new version of events, claiming that he had met Christy at a bar and that they had engaged in a consensual sexual encounter just hours before she was killed by someone else. He requested that new DNA testing be performed on the evidence found at the scene, including the cutting board, the toaster, and Christy's clothing. However, in April 2022, Lancaster County Judge Dennis Reinacre denied the petition. The judge ruled that Rowe's new claims did not meet the legal criteria for post-conviction testing, and that there was no reasonable possibility that new tests would prove his innocence given the totality of the evidence. Raymond Rowe remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. The case of Christy Mirac is a testament to the power of persistence, the evolution of science, and the enduring love of a family that refused to let their daughter be forgotten. It's also a chilling reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live among us, smiling, celebrating, and blending seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. For 26 years, Raymond Rowe was the DJ who played at your wedding, the entertainer who made your children laugh at school dances, the neighbor who attended church on Sundays. He was invisible because he was everywhere, but in the end, science caught up with him. A single piece of chewing gum, a revolutionary genealogy technique, and the tireless work of investigators brought justice to Christy Mirac, a young woman whose only crime was wanting to teach children and make the world a little brighter. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of never giving up on justice, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light and ensures that victims like Christy Mirac are never forgotten. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, and remember, the truth may take decades to emerge, but it will always find a way.